I am honored to welcome Teresa back to the College of Southern Maryland and Doug for the first time, because I think their collaboration is something essential, not just in a literary sense, it's in a human sense. So thank you all for coming. Sit back and enjoy, and please ask questions as the conversation unfolds. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Rachel Smith, who's going to introduce the two poets.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. I'm actually in a classroom and have students here, so can't see them, but they're here with us too. I'm going to introduce Doug Rawlings first. No particular reason. I just decided to go in that order. So, but I want to welcome Teresa and Doug both here. And yes, Teresa, welcome back. Nice to have you for me. So I barely met Doug, only a short Zoom meeting the other day from his home in Maine. But I can say that I love what he supports. His 3 books of poetry, his latest, Bamboo Bridge, collaborated with Teresa Chuc, which we will hear from today, and has helped co-founding the Veterans for Peace organization. Poetry and peace. I think that could end the introduction, but I have a little bit more to say. Doug, in an interview with a Maine publication down east, was asked and discusses his writing process and summarizes one of his poems written for Afghan war veterans. A poem to encourage connecting to the natural world, to rely on the sense to do so, not to preach, he says, but to share how he has navigated getting through this as in the necessary healing that seems impossible after surviving war. I love the idea of coming to your senses, as he says, for war veterans, not as in get over it, but instead to find power through our senses' gifts to us, much like his poem Fiddleheads from his book A Baker's Dozen, a poem about wondering aloud an innocent's question of what happens to a fist when the hand opens. And his sensible poetic reply of a butterfly, all yellow, green, and sunset red, brushed by, as if to say, open the fist, is to release all the beauty needed to save the world from war, or any pain at all, if we choose to allow it. This, I think, is a reminder of the human we are, the delicate and loving we are innately. And it is that his poetry serves to help us see the butterflies instead of trauma. Thank you for the work we do, Doug, and thank you for being here. And
Thank you.
Teresa, I always have to start with mentioning Goddard because that's how I know Teresa. We attended the same graduate school together. So I love that after all these years of first meeting you, that you've continued your work as a writer, and that I mean, we went to school in Vermont, and somehow with Wayne and who knew that we would be, working together still after all these years. And I just love that and think about it all the time. How fortunate I am to stay in touch with a lot of people that really, really changed my life. I think you are a beautiful person. But I think I know a little bit more about you now than I knew when you were at Goddard. You're a mother, a teacher, a friend of nature, and an amazing poet. I know a bit from Facebook too, and I feel comfortable mentioning that because of some of the wonderful things that you post, and think I should share it because I love them. The family orange tree passed down, the corn you were growing, your pet turtle, the avocado tree discovered in your new home's yard, and roses and new bookshelves, and so much more adventure that you're having now in your new home. I love that you share who you are and what you love, because I wish all Facebook posts were like yours. The inspiration to be a flower instead of material things we gather. Teresa's life seems to be one that supports loving the world we are in, even if our lives throw pain and crisis at our feet. Her past is one of refugee of the Vietnam-American War. I suppose she is a daughter of that time, a baby born into war approaching, no clue of anything other than the arms of her family, until pulled away, pushed away from home. But she grew up with a soft voice, a superpower of sorts that can calm any fight to be had, tough but gentle in hearing, as can be seen in her poem Cockroaches, when she offers the unbelievable reality of an offer to sell a child for food, and she was that child. She writes, "No, don't sell my sister. There are lots of cockroaches for us to eat." And then she ends the poem with this as evidence of her brother's love for her. Her brother, as the poem tells, was 4. Though there are harsh realities in Teresa's poems, there is more love than anything. How beautiful is it that through so much darkness, darkness of war, comes an open hand, not a fist. I think Teresa wills her senses just as Doug does, to feel, to overcome, to love, even through the horrors of war. Thank you both so much for being here. I am going to let the two of you start discussing by talking a little bit about how this collaboration started and what the conversation in the book is.
Thank you, Rachel and Wayne and Neil, for this honor. And to be with Teresa is a super, super honor. This book began, I think, and Teresa, jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but I am an editor of a Veterans for Peace newspaper quarterly called Peace and Planet News, which has come out in print form and is also now available online. And we have a section of that paper referred to as the Poet's Corner. So we're always looking for poetry. And a friend of mine out in Los Angeles, and Teresa is from Los Angeles, is in Los Angeles right now. And I'm in Maine, so interesting leap across the country here. But looking for poems, and they told me about Teresa's poems, and then Teresa sent some poems to us, and I was just literally just really taken away by these wonderful, amazing poems. And so then Teresa and I just started corresponding via email and poetry, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and came up with this notion that maybe we ought to put our poems together in a book, because we are, in a sense, dealing with similar themes. And we've divided the book into 5 different sections: the family, before the war, during the war, after the war, and moral injury. And so that's our collaboration. That's where we're going with it. So Teresa, jump in here.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Rachel, for your comments. Really touched my heart. It's such an honor to be here and conversing with Doug and sharing with the students. And I think you described our meeting really well. When we began exchanging emails, for example, Doug would share a poem and I would see like, wow, I have a poem that's on the same subject and it's very similar, and I'll share it with Doug. And then we just went back and forth for a while, and we realized, wow, we have so many poems on different themes, but we're both struggling. We're both working through our post-war through poetry and dealing with similar themes. So Doug was in Vietnam before I was born, and Doug was a soldier and I was a boat refugee, but we both dealt with the consequences of the war, and some ways similar and in some ways different. But and my dad was a veteran of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So some things that Doug went through, I could see that in my father. And having the conversation with Doug really helped me to understand and to heal and know that the soldiers that went through the war, they also struggle with it, that I'm not alone. I know that I'm not alone, but to have this conversation with Doug in a poetic way really delve deep into and really help me examine our experiences and the parallels.
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful for our collaboration.
Oh, me too. And here's a note of interest. Teresa's my daughter's age, so we're crossing generations here as well as gender and ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. So let me start with a poem that I wrote about my daughter, sort of. It's entitled Bicentennial Poem, Autumn 1976, Bath, Maine. My daughter Jennifer is 2 now and can almost speak in complete sentences. Why, if this were 7 years ago and she Vietnamese, she'd almost be old enough to sell her mother. My wife does not like this poem because it's pretty harsh, but it does speak to the reality of war that a lot of people are not aware of, I don't think, the impact of war. And one of the things I noticed when I came back and began my family was the wonder in the eyes of my son and daughter when they were little kids. And I realized that we took that wonder away from the Vietnamese children. I was in a little fire base in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. And people would come up from the village of Bong San by the wire to sell us various things, drugs and prostitutes. And imagine a 10 or 11-year-old girl talking to a 22-year-old guy trying to sell that guy drugs, right? And I realized what their lives would have been like had we not been there. So that's a memory that stays with me for a long, long time.
Thank you, Doug. And I wanted to share a poem when I was 2. So Doug's daughter was 2 years old at that time. He wrote his poem, which is similar to my age. And this poem is about when I was 2 years old and on a refugee boat. Immigration. It is October when the winds of autumn blow strong in the Pacific. There are over 2,000 of us, sardines, barely human and starving. We sleep on the floor and wash ourselves with seawater. People are sick. When someone dies from sickness, she or he is wrapped in a blanket and tossed overboard during a Buddhist chant. I was only 2 years old and cannot recollect the dying next to me, nor can I recollect my constant coughing, nor can I recall seeing my mother's worried countenance as she contemplated our future, how my constant crying made her want to jump overboard. And in the poem is also the struggle of the mother.
Let me read a poem here entitled Giving Silence, and I wrote this for my son when he was turning 13. And our culture, I think, unfortunately, as far as I know anyways, does not have a real ritual for boys turning to men. It used to be the military back in the day. So I'm thinking about this as my son is turning 13. And I make reference by the way, to something that I discovered in reading Margaret Mead. She was in New Guinea and discovered that this one tribe, about the age of 13 or 14, they grabbed the boys, the men would grab the boys and drag them into the jungle, and there'd be a lot of yelling and screaming and stuff. They take them into the jungle, and then they would cut themselves, the men would, and bleed into a gourd and then pass the gourd to the boys to drink their blood and said, now you're a man. And then they were welcomed back into the village by the women as men. So I have a sort of an allusion to that in this poem. It's called Giving Silence. If Nam vets were ancient shamans, now would be the moment we choose to give you shelter from the coming storm. But we're merely survivors of suburbs and cities, not forest nor mountain. Modern men offering you our silences, our words to guide you going out on your own. Yet we have known for years now that the silences of our fathers will not do. And we have found that words alone cannot be the sacred knives you need to bleed you free of your raging doubts. So listen up to what we have found between our own silences. Open up your fists, watch women move, scorn uniforms, don't march, dance.
Thank you, Doug. And I have a poem that I wrote for my son too. And I kind of view it's our way of telling our children or teaching them a better way and hoping for a better world for them. Photosynthesis. How can I convince you that you do have chlorophyll, that you can take the sun's energy and turn it into sugar, produce something sweet inside of you, take the waste people breathe out and make it into something that will keep you alive, that will keep those around you alive, create oxygen. Why do you say that this metaphor doesn't work, that you don't have the powers of a plant, that nature didn't intend you that way? Look how you twist and turn towards the light.
If it's okay, I think we talked about having a couple of questions. So a couple of things have come to mind that I don't want to lose. The first one was poetry as a healing process, so that both of you have had to, I mean, you have memories, right? That I think what is common, especially maybe with PTSD, and a lot of veterans might feel that it's better to suppress the memories and certainly not to conjure them up and make them vivid. But poetry does something else. It's more of a conversation and a self-reflection, but it's also something to share. So I wonder if both of you, with your very similar experiences, but different experiences with that, Teresa, yours being something that you almost have to put pieces together, to and listen to other stories to understand your own story, and then Doug, you're actually bearing witness.
I was just going to say, I was doing exactly that, suppressing my trauma for most of my childhood because I just didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to have anything to do with the war because of the pain and violence that was happening in my life due to it. I just wanted to move on, to keep going, but it doesn't leave you. It manifests in different ways, the violence, that cycle of violence, until you deal with it. So it was when I realized that my life, that violence was just going in a circle, and I had to stop and really face what happened to my father, his PTSD, its effect on me and the family, the war and its effect on me and the family, was when I really began to heal. And writing was really important for me because the stories, the traumatic and painful stories that I held in my body, I think a part of us, we keep those. We don't want to let them go because it makes us who we are, even though it was very difficult to go through that trauma. But it has physical health effects on us. It could be mental, emotional effects as well. And by writing it out onto paper, I realized that I don't have to remember it, but I don't have to forget it. So I can still remember the stories, but I don't have to hold on to it on a cellular level. And that was very liberating. I think writing also allows us to go back to those moments and re-examine them slowly, carefully, and deeply. And in my case, I wanted to, because I was dealing a lot with family and people, I wanted to go back and look at those memories with as much compassion as possible to understand all sides. And
Yeah.
that was part of my healing. So writing and poetry was essential. It was a way for me to survive.
Yeah, for three or 4 years, every week I would go up to our Veterans Administration Hospital psychiatric ward, and I would lead the patients in discussions using poetry. We would look at poetry from the Civil War forward, from Walt Whitman right through the Iraq, Afghanistan wars. And the patients that were there, they about 8 or 10 of them gathered in a circle with the nurse. It's a high lockup situation. These are mostly suicidal patients, and they were all keeping journals, therapeutic journals. And what I would tell them is say, we'd read some poems, and I'd say, try writing a poem of your own, using your therapeutic journal, but write a poem out of it and turn it into an artifact that sort of sets aside from you. So then you can talk to people about the poem, not necessarily about what you're going through. So you're discussing the poem, but at the same time, you're discussing what's going on with you. And I have a poem that's related to that. And I have to give people a warning ahead of time. There's some profanities in this, which is the nature of veterans talking amongst each other. Okay. We're good? Okay. So this is entitled Daymare at the VA Psychiatric Ward. The he in this, by the way, is an Iraq War veteran. He wanted to explain that it wasn't no nightmare, man. It happened like this. I was suddenly awake sometime mid-afternoon, standing naked in the yard, pitching stones at the church across the road. My wife thought I should be put in here, and I really fucked up raising my kids too. I'm sorry, man, I really am. To which the 8 of us, non-vets and others, including the ward nurse, said, it's okay, man. We all fuck up once in a while. And we all laughed, him too, at the absurdity of it all. Well, no shit. Why else would we be in here? Building 206, 3rd floor under lock and key, brothers and a sister circling the chairs, warding off the slings and arrows of those who have no clue, trying to get it together for another trip through this love. And that's what I found in those settings was, you know, an hour and a half together. There was some real love going on there. We were all veterans, and we're all there for each other. And the nurse was an exceptional human being. So yeah, I think that's the power of poetry.
That's so beautiful. And I wish my father had some kind of support system when he came back, but he didn't. He would meet up with some of his friends from childhood in Vietnam like once a year, but there wasn't any kind of mental health support or supporting creating things. He actually stopped creating. He used to play the guitar in a band, and after he got out of prison, the Viet Cong prison, he went back, and my mom's adoptive parents were still in Vietnam, and they thought they saw ghosts when they saw my father, because it was 9 years, and it was suddenly he was out. And he actually had left his guitar with them or with a friend, and he got his guitar back, and he brought it all the way back to the US. Now my middle son plays it. But he stopped playing music. I have a poem that kind of speaks to what he went through and is connected with me. Violin. When my father kicked my violin against the stove, there was a crash, and the wood carved so lovingly cracked with the force, splintered away from the hole into silence. I was about 12 years old then, remembering my father, the war, his anger, the broken neck of the violin, the collapsed bridge, severed sound vibrations. the arc of the instrument's shoulder I once held in my hand, and the empty curving space that was the window to the world. I am thinking of the trajectory of circles, bombs, my waist, a wanting and needing to let go.
Teresa, wonder, I mean, that the image in there is so strong, and literally kicking it into silence. I wonder, I'm thinking that for many of our students, perhaps they don't know as much about the situation that happened to the Vietnamese at the end of the war, and the boat refugees, and the reason your father was in a prison camp, basically, for all those years. So I wonder if you might just speak a little bit about that, about the context of that, about that situation.
Sure. So at the fall of Saigon, that was when the North and the People's Army was winning the war. The US was retreating. And when they took Saigon at the fall of Saigon, that was the ending of the war. So my father told me when the Viet Cong were coming in, he had a gun. He held a gun to his head. He was going to shoot himself, but my mother convinced him not to. And what happened was, many people, especially if you were in the military, and my father was a captain in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which was the Southern Vietnamese army that fought with the US. Many people had to report for re-education, and my mother told me that they told my dad that it would be 10 days to pack enough food and things for 10 days. And at this time, my mom was pregnant with me. And so my father packed in enough things for 10 days. And the next day, she said there was a knock on the door, checking to make sure if my dad had reported. And for people who don't report to re-education when they're supposed to, they take them out and shoot them. So the first year, my mother lost all contact with my father. She didn't know where he was taken. He was actually taken up north to the jungles on the border of North Vietnam and China. And he ended up being there for 9 years. So meanwhile, my mother was facing a lot of discrimination, and it was very, very difficult to live. And so we fled Vietnam as boat refugees. My mother took my brother and I. When we got here, my mother didn't really know much English, and it was a real struggle. And as a child, I remember wondering, where's my father? And what is this thing about the war? I didn't understand, and prison. And we were treated really badly. There were a lot of, they would call us fresh off the boats, and there was a lot of discrimination, and it was an adjustment, but we were, it was at the same time we were welcomed here, and we were given a place of refuge. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, you're both in these first poems, particularly about relationships with parents and children, the sense of second generation trauma being passed on from one generation to another is very, very strong, very, very disturbing. The picture of your father and yourself there, and for both of you, for you and Doug also. I mean, you've obviously dealt with the war through poetry and through your work as a peace activist in healthy ways. Yet, do you find that there's any passing on of the trauma to your children? How has that affected that relationship with your children? So I guess I'm sort of asking that to both of you, and you can go into reading poems that help us.
That's an incredibly sensitive area to go, Wayne. Well, both I have a son and a daughter, and they're in their mid 40s now. So, and I have two granddaughters. And you know, I've wrestled with this, obviously, as you have, right? I mean, we all do. You know, what do we say to our kids? What do we tell our kids, and what don't we? You know, and can we hide stuff from them? And I found it a pretty unhealthy experience trying to suppress this experience, as Teresa alluded to. It's you just have to compartmentalize it or put it someplace. Hence the forming of Veterans for Peace in 1985 gave me and then subsequently other veterans an outlet to take our experience and turn it into a positive way. That is speaking to the younger generations about the realities of war, which our fathers did not do, right? The World War II generation didn't speak to us. I mean, I learned about war by watching John Wayne movies and stuff, right? I had no idea what was going on. So we felt an obligation to somehow talk about the realities of war, but without burdening our children, you know, without burying them in it. And I don't have any answers to that. I guess we try. I love both my children; they love me. We've got a wonderful relationship together. We share lots of things together. So, but I know lots of other veterans that's not the case. So. And we're looking at what's the figure now? 22 veterans a day commit suicide. 22 a day. So even 50 years later, we're struggling with that stuff. And then maybe I'll get me on another track here, but the average age of an American soldier in Vietnam was 19.
Yeah, my age. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're not looking at people who have really emerged into adulthood just yet. No offense to folks who are 18 and 19. I teach a class, by the way, at the University of Maine Farmington, and first year students who are 18 and 19 years old. So, it's just the notion that, you were given a weapon and given freedom to kill with some fair amount of impunity at that age can impact you, obviously, for the rest of your life. So I guess I'm traveling off of that. Can I read a real quick poem here just about that?
Yeah.
Okay, it's called Leaving the Induction Center. We're now all riders on those olive drab government buses, trying to make some sense out of this thing they called military justice. Still a bunch of miners digging about in our own little ruins, burrowing through the dangerous trash of our own silly illusions. We're all of us just drifters caught up in a dirty little war, left to ride it out alone on our own thin little prayers. And this war was unique in the sense that we went over there. Many of us went over there, not in units. We went over there individually. I didn't know anybody when I got to Travis Air Force Base, got on that plane and flew to Vietnam and got off at Pontoon Air Force. I didn't know anybody. I was totally alone. And then shoveled around and ended up in a different place. And I think that's the truth. I think that happened to a lot of us. So it was very difficult to be young. I digress.
Thank you, Doug. And I think it really helped me to understand the American soldiers' experience when you really bring that up in your poems, how young you were and how young the soldiers were. And I look at my own children and my students, and that's the age, 18, being sent over to another country to kill people, and that trauma. And my father had just graduated from high school. He was studying law when he was drafted in Vietnam to be a soldier fighting in their army. For me, it was the cycle of violence. So when my father came, he brought back the horrors of being a soldier, the horrors of fighting in the war, and then the horrors of being in prison camp for 9 years. And it was very violent growing up. if you read some of my poems, you'll see, and that was part of me separating it from my body, from like knives being thrown at me, being chased with an axe, you know, by my father saying he's going to kill me, literally chased by an axe, after he had smashed every door lock with the axe and then chasing me. And I remember as a child, I would tell myself, you know, once I grew up, once I leave, I didn't, you know, I want a peaceful life. I don't want anything like this. And then with my ex-husband, this was when I realized that I needed a lot of healing, because when it got to a point where I said, well, at least he's not throwing a knife at me. At least he's not chasing me with an axe saying he's going to kill me. That's when I realized that my healing was not done, that I couldn't just pretend that the war didn't exist, to pretend that I'm over it without dealing with it, because I realized that, wow, this is all I knew in my life, and this was the standard I was going by, was my father. And so that was when I realized, okay, I need to find out what happened with my father. Why was he like this? And I need to find out what happened during the war. And it was difficult because my body physically had an aversion to reading anything about the war. And I had to really force myself, because I had to face this, because what was happening was not just affecting me, but my children. So I realized that the healing of my kids was bound to my healing, that I had to heal, that I had to be able to build healthy relationships, even though I did not come from any. And yeah, and I think the really difficult thing that we're still healing from is my children. Well, one of my sons, you know, who spent the most time with my father, his grandfather. My father has not, you know, some of that PTSD still comes out. So even as a teenager, or young child, he's had to deal with some of the things, not that kind of violence that I had to deal with, but other things you know, that my father is still healing from. It's been a process of healing for him. He never got any psychiatric or therapy. And I think for him, a lot of the healing just came from gardening, connecting with the earth again, but in a way that's not violent. I have a poem about my father and his healing. When I first saw Daddy, he was like an Egyptian cat, skinny, foraging, and stern, just released from a Vietcong prison. He told us he hated the color red. 16 years later, he wears a red sweatshirt and smiles, the pin tip opening in his heart enough to let in a driblet of red. And now I'm at the point with my father where I can talk to him normal. We don't have conversations, but we can be okay with each other, and I can understand and appreciate his struggles and what he went through.
You know, when I went to school in Cleveland, college in Cleveland, Ohio, and I dated this woman, and then we separated and broke up, and then I got drafted, and she had moved to Philadelphia, and I started writing her from Vietnam, and then over the period of that year that I was there, I came up with this idea that I wanted to meet her out in California. This is amazing. She agreed to meet me in San Francisco when I met her in San Francisco, not knowing me for well over a year. The risk that she took. So we've been married 51 years now. Okay. And what we did was we met in San Francisco, then went down to Los Angeles and decided to hitchhike across the country. So we spent 3 weeks on the road. What I did to my parents, now I know as a parent, I know how that damaging that must have been to my parents, because there was no contact with us at all. But for her to take that risk to be with me. So I wrote this poem. It's entitled Survivor's Manual, and it's to Judy, the woman to whom I've been married for 51 years now. If your arms and legs are still intact, you are a survivor. If tall meadow grasses still delight you with their sudden pheasants, you are a survivor. If the faces of passing children remain the faces of passing children, you are a survivor. If your nightmares will wait for the night, you are a survivor. If you can find your way back into someone's love, you, my friend, are a survivor. I dedicate that to Judy.
It's beautiful. I want to read a poem. It has different layers. So this one is about, it's called Agent Blue, so which was a chemical that was used during the American War in Vietnam to destroy the rice crops to prevent them from absorbing. But it's also about PTSD and trauma, how like what that does is it prevents you from loving. It prevents you from absorbing love from the people around you. And I think, as you say, Doug, if you could still love, you're a survivor. Agent Blue. To kill correctly takes calculation down to a science. Arsenic, cacodylic acid, no water and rice on a cellular level. Make sure no surviving seed can be collected and planted, because even a small seed assures survival, because mortars, grenades, and bombs cannot destroy a grain, because our heart is made of seeds. Know what it takes to kill the seeds. Know what it takes to deprive the plant of water, to dehydrate it, to be surrounded by love, but unable to absorb it. And I think we are survivors.
We are.
What's that do to you now, watching what we're watching in the world, watching what's happening in Ukraine, watching all that stuff? What does that do to, I know how deeply I'm affected by that, but as far as the healing process you're talking about, I mean, there's such kind of triumph in the way that both of you have dealt with it in such positive ways. But how about this? How are you feeling now? And I'm going to set up after that and let you guys read poems, and then we should take some questions from.
Let me respond real quickly to that, because I'm totally confused. I just had my students read, and I highly recommend Martin Luther King Jr.'s Riverside Church address, because he's talking about the war in Vietnam. But he begins by saying how incredibly difficult it is to be in times that are so complex, and we're so disoriented and don't know where to turn and stuff. So he turns to this notion of universal love. But what gets us, I think, what really gets disheartening for me in Veterans for Peace, we formed Veterans for Peace in 1985, and our principal thing was to abolish war. And we talk to people about war, and people are listening to us. And then the Iraq War takes place in a heartbeat. Boom. Same thing with this Ukraine thing, right? We talk about, the horrors of war, and people, nod their heads and stuff like that. But now, it's like, we got to throw more weapons. We got to do this. We got to do that. And it's so disheartening, I suppose, is the word, and confusing for me. And I, like I said, I teach a course in peace studies. I'm working with 18 and 19-year-olds, and I'm looking at them thinking, my God, you're going to be like me. Don't do this. Don't fall down this rabbit hole of war being the answer. So that's my confusion. Teresa.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I remember I actually first heard about the war in the Ukraine from my students because they're like, I think I'm going to go fight. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then I learned about it, and it's really heartbreaking because there are no winners in war. There are no winners and there are no sides. And it's this creation of opposing camps and ideologies and greed and the hypocrisy also of the media in the US and the government. And it's really sad because we know that the tragedy of war and then how after war there's another war, and how this is the war, interior war, that all of these people, the trauma that they're going to have to face from loss and from displacement, it's
Yeah.
it's a lot of suffering. And
Yeah. Ironically, this war is much like the Vietnam War in the sense that the military learned there were a lot of independent journalists during the Vietnam War and a lot of footage, documentary footage, taken during the war. My parents would be watching the TV while I was over there, and their little ticker tape saying 267 soldiers were killed in Vietnam this week, et cetera, et cetera. And then so the government decided to embed journalists, right? So they couldn't have that kind of freedom for the Iraq and the Afghanistan war. But what's happening in Ukraine now with the social media is people are really, truly getting these firsthand accounts of the horrors of war. And I'm hoping that's driving home the message that you're mentioning, Teresa, about how horrific this stuff is. It doesn't matter what your political side is. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. Who doesn't matter. There are these people who are caught up in this thing who are suffering incredibly because of this war.
yeah, and the people are the ones who are suffering on both sides. And I love how in the upcoming article you have the people holding the sign in Russian that says no war. I can read Russian, so I read it. And because it also shows that the people, they're against this too. It doesn't matter what side. I think everyone wants peace, the people, but it's these other factors, the government, the greed, and these ideological differences. It's devastating.
We have a sister chapter, a Veterans for Peace chapter in Komi Republic of Russia, and I'm corresponding. I've formed a sister relationship with this chapter of Veterans for Peace, and they're mostly Afghan War veterans. That's the equivalent of the Vietnam War. Our first field trip, if you will, in 1987, we sent a contingent of our Vietnam veterans to the Soviet Union to meet with Russian soldiers who were coming back from Afghanistan, and we have this bond, and the bond is that we're human beings. Forget this nationalism, forget this, ranting and raving about whose political agenda is more correct than the other. We're all human beings, and we've seen the horrors of war, and we just want it to end. How it's going to, I don't know. Every person in this panel sitting here, all the young people, if we can all gather together out in the streets and say no to war, what's the Carl Sandburg poem, with a little girl standing there at a parade and said, what if they gave a war and no one came?
Mm.
That's what we gotta do.
Mm-hmm. 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 And the consequences too. I don't know what chemicals are being used in the Ukraine, but in Vietnam, in addition to Agent Blue, there was the more well-known Agent Orange. And I'll read that poem too right now, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. Agent Orange. It's difficult to be alone without a mother's touch in a crib like a baby, except one is not. A son taught to live with a thirst for a mother who loves her child, though one of his legs is too short, the other too long. He sits, arms bent and limp, but do not avoid him. He wants to interact. His swollen eyes and misshapen head leans back. In a dream, mother holds him close, as if by her embrace alone, she will somehow right the wrong. The chemical traveled through her placenta to the womb, where small limbs that needed to form couldn't, where the tiny body the size of a fist no longer knew what to do. It was named for the orange band around each 55-gallon drum, orange as a sunrise that permeates one's soul, how its rays cover the sky and the earth with a deep orange, rising as those bodies also rise. And it's one of those things that when there's war, it makes me think about like what chemicals are being used. Like in Afghanistan, there was depleted uranium, and the effects on the ecosystem, the environment, the water, the land, and the babies, and generations to come. When I visited Vietnam a few years ago, went back to my birth city, Saigon, there's a peace village, and there were children without arms, without legs, and an ICU unit where newborns were still being born with the effects of Agent Orange. So it's devastating. I just wish that we could have diplomacy, that we can resolve issues and just look at each other as human beings. Because I know, like, even meeting North Vietnamese writers a few years ago at the William Joyner Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Boston was really healing, because we talked to each other and we shared our writings, our poetry, and to know that, wow, during the war, how could we have even been thinking of these people were my parents' age. So my father and this, like my uncle, they would have been trying to kill each other. And just like you may have been trying to kill my father, and my father may have been trying to kill you. And just the thought of it is just.
Yeah, our chapter in Vietnam brings American Vietnam veterans to Vietnam all the time, and they have those very conversations, sitting around drinking beer, laughing, actually, saying, I was there too. You were trying to kill me. I was trying to kill you, right? Here, have another beer. One of my good friends, Dud Hendrick, was involved in a bicycle trip, and they made a film of this, by the way, of North Vietnamese soldiers and American soldiers who were wounded in the war. They put together a bike trip from Hanoi to Saigon, and with a side trip to My Lai, as a matter of fact. And the conversation, and when you watch this film, you see these conversations taking place. It's incredibly moving, right? Because they're just looking at each other as just human beings and say, what the heck was I thinking? Why would I want to try to kill you? On both sides of the issue. I think we're running out of time. I'm getting sense.
I was thinking maybe this is a good opportunity while people hopefully start generating questions for the Q&A, that maybe you could talk a little bit about the title, Bamboo Bridge, and what that means, because some of what you were just talking about, this whole piece, putting it all together and building this bridge together, I think could be useful information for our students. And then while they're telling that story, if anyone who wants to ask additional questions, please remember that the Q&A is available.
It was Teresa's idea. Teresa, take full credit for this wonderful title for this book. And maybe you could show it. Could you do a screen share and show a cover of the book, or is that technologically too challenging here?
The title, it was, I think, a physical representation of what we're trying to do, build a bridge across a river so that we can have understanding and compassion, understand each other's experiences. And bamboo, because in Vietnam they build bamboo bridges, and I like the idea of bamboo too, because it's it also shows in some bamboo is very strong, yet also it's also very it can be fragile as well, and it's made by hand. So this bridge, so one by one, it was kind of like we were putting these poems together and communicating via the poetry. It was like we were building the bridge with each bamboo, each poem.
I have a fond memory that I was outside this village of Bong Son in the Central Highlands I mentioned before. After about 7 or 8 months in country, myself and 3 other guys decided that we'd had it with this war. And so we left our encampment, our fire base, and we would go to the edge of the village, and one person, and then we take off our flak jackets, our helmets, and our M16s. And one of the guys stayed and watched those while the others of us went into the village unarmed, without a helmet, without a flak jacket, without a weapon. And there was a bamboo bridge across the Bong Son River. I have an incredibly fond memory of that bridge, of walking across that bridge unarmed, just saying, we want to come in peace, right? We want, as naive perhaps as we were, we just thought of that. So when Teresa came up with this notion of the bamboo bridge, it really resonated with me big time.
I think that's another thing. Like when you have a bridge, you have to physically walk across that bridge. It doesn't just happen. It doesn't just fall down from the sky that there's a connection. Like you actually have to make those connections and build those bridges. And
you're very vulnerable on a bridge. And when you write poetry, you really are vulnerable. You're really opening yourself up. You're not, if you're writing good poetry, you're not proselytizing or judgment. You're just trying to dig deep inside. And by the way, thank you for this experience, because it made me go back and dig into this book called 40 Poems Touching on Recent American History, edited by Robert Bly, where he talks about political poetry. And that's what he talks about. It's opening yourself up and digging deep into yourself, but also exposing yourself.
Let me make a commercial comment. Doug, can you tell people how to obtain the book?
Yeah, if you're interested in this book, you can go to Amazon and pay $40 plus shipping. Yuck. Or you could send me a note at my email address, and I will get the book for you at cost, which is $20. And then I'll mail it to you. And it takes about 3 weeks for me to get it through the publisher. I have to order it, especially through the publishing company down in North Carolina. But I'd be glad to do that if you want to send me an email making the request. And when I get the book, I'll notify you I've gotten the book, and you could send me a check for $20 and your address, and I'll mail it to you.
I had one question. Well, there are more, but to Doug and I think Teresa as well. If you had not gone through the experience that you did, would you have taken up a career in teaching?
I'm vehemently shaking my head no. Teresa is contemplating it. I was drafted out of graduate school. I was working on an MBA. I had a degree in economics. My father was an executive at Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York, and he wanted me to work at Kodak, become a corporate lawyer, and that was that was the game plan. And then the war came, and it totally changed my whole life. And I spent a year in Boston just working in odd jobs, trying to figure out what to do. And I don't know how it came. And I decided, you know what I want to do? I want to teach high school English. I hated high school, by the way. But I had to go back an extra year of school, Seattle University, pick up literature courses. Then I got my Master of Arts in Teaching at Boston College. And I went into teaching. And I guess I discovered a fair amount of Vietnam veterans actually did go into teaching for some reason. I think we wanted to change the world. This was the 70s when we thought that was possible.
Teresa?
Yeah, I went into teaching because I love literature and I love writing and I love working with the youth, and I think having some positive impact, hopefully. I think there's a 50-50. No, I think there's a actually pretty good chance, because I also went into teaching for my children. But yeah, that's a good question, because of all the events that lead to it. But I love my job. Actually, this is my 15th year teaching high school English, and through the toughest times I realized, you know, I'm doing something I love, and I'm reading the literature that I love. I'm discussing it with my students, and then, you know, my students too. So that keeps me going.
I retired from the university 10 years ago, and I'm still teaching. I still go in and teach a first year seminar for students for that very same thing, Teresa. It's just like, you know, and all the students who are here, you know, it's a two-way street. I get so much from my students. I learned so much from their writing and stuff like that. So it's keeps me going. It really does.
I think it's notable that people like you, Teresa, and Doug have, and Wayne and Rachel and I try to do the same thing, that you dedicate your life to teaching. To what end? Another question I had from a student was, once Ukraine is done, what's the next one? And I'm like, well, how do you explain that? How, you know? And so one of the answers that I gave was, well, what's the alternative, right? You want to give up, or do you want to keep making the case for peace and for love, right?
You know, I'm telling you, because I'm fresh out of this thing. In fact, I'm correcting quizzes this afternoon on the Riverside Church address by Martin Luther King Jr. And he says exactly that. He said, we're going to continue to have these wars unless we get over the three triplets that prop up this culture. One, he says, is extreme materialism. One is racism, and one is militarism. And we have to face those things front on and say, why are we spending more than half of our budget on a military budget when all the education, health, et cetera, is being put aside? And he addresses that, you know, in that speech. He talks about how they had these amazing poverty programs going, and then the Vietnam War came along, and they got rid of all of those programs and started funding that war. He said, we got to get rid of this notion of this nationalistic sense that we're better, you know, than other cultures, and our nation is better than other cultures. And we've got to have some humility and work with other people across national boundaries. And now I'm really going to shut up. But I'll say one of the things I've said over and over again is that one of the worst things that human beings ever invented was the nation state, right? What's the difference between a Mexican and somebody living in the United States, or a Canadian, or a Ukrainian, or a Russian, or a German, or a French person? What's the difference? It's these artificial national boundaries that are getting us into all this difficulty.
Yes, I agree with you 110%. And I think one of the things, in addition to that, stopping thinking to stop thinking that the US is like better than all the countries and these and the nation state. And I think it's also our relationship to the land. I think our relationship to the land has been severed through this greed and industrialization and materialism that you mentioned, because a lot of the when you respect the land and the people on the land, especially the original people with the knowledge of the land, and it's abundant. We have everything to feed everybody in the in the world, because nature provides it all for us. But sadly, it's this exploitation. Instead of building a reciprocal relationship and a regenerative relationship with the land, it's just completely stripping it of resources and then going to other countries and taking resources from there as well. I think if we can build a reciprocal relationship with the land and a better respect for her, we can have more peace. Because I think a lot of the wars, one of the motivators is to go take resources from other lands. And usually that's not talked about, how the land is affected and the ecosystems are affected during war. But I think this is something that really needs to be addressed, and it can't be avoided. If we really want peace, we have to develop a better relationship with the land, which we're giving back, and really actually taking care of the land that we're on.
I want to brag a little bit about Veterans for Peace. One of our more recent actions was to join in Standing Rock with indigenous people up there fighting against the pipeline. And our members who went up there, mostly city folks, right, were just stunned by the relationship between the indigenous people amongst themselves, between the elders and younger generations. And I think one of the things happening to this culture is that they're figuring out different ways to even divide us by generation. Like, I'm a boomer, right? And you're a zoomer, or you're an X, and back and forth, separating us. And what our members saw up at Standing Rock was that didn't happen. There was mutual respect, cutting across generations, right? And we've got to go there too. And I agree 100% with you, Teresa. If we can get back in the environment, that's why I moved to Maine. I live in rural Maine. I live in an 1820s farmhouse, right? So, and I have organic gardens, and that's the way.
Okay, no, I just want to thank you both. And Neil, it's been a wonderful conversation. I think we could go on for on and on and on. So you do great work in healing, and thank you for that. Thank you for your poetry.
I agree. We had a conversation one time. Wayne and I brought a writer in, and a student asked, "Can poetry save the world?" And I think it was Yusuf Kamiaka. He said, "Yeah, yeah. And I think that's what you're in the process of doing, in very small ways. But you know what? Like I said, what's the alternative? You walk away.
Yeah. Well, 5 of us in Maine started Veterans for Peace in 1985. Now we have 6,000 members. We have 6 international chapters. We have NGO status at the United Nations. Who'd have thunk? I didn't think that when we started that up, but it was just like, and we're an educational, organization. We're not a, service organization, but we've become a service organization as well as an educational organization. And it just started because we just had to do something. We had to do something. And I think I'm saying I have a lot of hope, of dealing with younger people, because I have the same sense of urgency, mostly around the climate, around the environment. And we have to do something. right? And what we've been doing in the past ain't working. So something's got to come up. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. My students have all left me. I have a couple that left a couple of questions, but they've already been sort of answered throughout the discussion. But I did have a student email me and said that she had to jump off a little early, but how helpful it was to hear the two of you talk to each other, because her father is a Vietnam veteran and he's never spoke about it. And it really gave her a much better understanding. And then another student chimed in the Q&A and said something very similar. So with that idea of healing, not only are you helping, circumstances that you've had to live through, but so many people that we don't even know about, we might never know about unless we, do put on programs such as this and make it so that you have a platform to tell your stories and share your poetry. So I always think that's the best outcome from these readings is finding out how it actually does touch the audience, and especially our students who are just, really like we were talking about, they're 18, 19 years old, but even some of the older students still don't know how to talk about these, things like war and trauma, even in their own families, they've never known how to talk about it. So very important. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Neil. Thank you,
Yes.
Doug. And I think one heart at a time. Yeah. And that's where the transformation takes place. Thank you for sharing about your students.
Yeah, thank you for giving this opportunity. Means a lot.
Yes, I think it's part of the healing process too. Being heard, sharing our stories.
We have this project in Veterans for Peace, what we've done for the last 6 Memorial Days. We write letters to the wall. And we've collected over 500 letters, which we've delivered to the wall. We put together 3 anthologies. Half a dozen of them are written by students from my class. And so I'm having students this semester, I've given them the opportunity to write a letter to the wall, to the grandparents, actually. 3 or 4 of them are writing to the grandparents who have not spoken about the war much at all. And so they're taking this chance to write to them. So I offer that opportunity to your students as well. We've stopped going to DC because of the COVID thing, but we have members who live down there. And if your students want to write a letter to that wall, we'll put it in an envelope that says, "Please read me." And we put it at the foot of the wall on Memorial Day. And then it's collected by the National Archives system, by the way. They're kept. And so I offer your students that opportunity if they want to write a letter.
Can we find out the information on how to do that on your website?
Yes, on my website. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should we look at any more of the Q&A, or are we wrapping up?
I just hear my grandchildren entering the house, so for me, I think I think it's time out.
Listen, all I can say to wrap things up is, years ago when I joined the college and I met Wayne, and he had this reading series that he wanted to have conversations. That was over 30 years ago, but that we're still doing it. Oh, that we're still doing it, and we hear voices like yours, Teresa and Doug. It's beyond measure. Like I am so happy to have had this conversation, and it's been recorded, and we'll post the link as soon as we get it up, and so you can share it with people who couldn't make it today. Noon is a little awkward, but the conversation itself is so essential, and I want to thank both of you sincerely.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor.